Welcome to the NAIFA webinar, NAIFA's State GR Give and Take webinar, 2019 State Advocacy Preview, and NAIC Fall 2018 National Meeting Recap. This is Brendan Burnett, Director of Professional Development, and with me are Gary Sanders, Counsel and Vice President, Government Relations, and Steve Klein, Director, Government Relations. Today, Gary and Steve will review activity from the Fall 2019 NAIC meeting and discuss what NAIFA sees as being the hot-button topics of the states for 2019. Throughout the broadcast, you are encouraged to type questions in the question box on the right side of your screen and to provide updates and information about legislative and regulatory activity in your state. Please provide information both on the specific issues being discussed by Gary and Steve, as well as on any other issues you are following. You may also click on the Raise Your Hand option, and I'll take you off mute. This webinar is being recorded, and a web link to access the recorded webinar will be made available to you. Gary, welcome.
Thanks, Brendan. For those of you who have been on these calls before, what I'm saying in the next couple minutes is going to be repetitious, but for those of you who haven't been on these calls before, Steve and I hold these calls 3 times a year, generally following an NAIC meeting, and we talk about both what happened at the just concluded NAIC meeting as well as what we see happening in the states. Depending on the time of the year, we either talk about a preview of what's going to be happening with state lawmakers, what just happened, what we expect to happen, so depending on the timing of it determines what we talk about. Also what Brendan said, and this is very important, we really want you all to participate if you can, either by, I think, raising your hand on your computer or however else you want to do so. We rely on what you folks have to say and what you tell us about what's going on in your states so that we can help you out better. So if you have any comments, any questions, please feel free, and let me encourage you to participate, because these calls are really more importantly for you to share information with us. We'll start off by talking about the NAIC meeting, and even though Brendan said it was the just concluded Fall 2019 NAIC meeting, we don't have a crystal ball yet for what's going to happen at that next meeting. So we're going to talk about the just concluded Fall 2018 NAIC meeting, which was held in late November. First, let me turn it over to Steve to start talking about a couple of issues at the NAIC. Steve?
Great. All right. Thanks, Gary. At the last NAIC meeting, a couple of issues I'll mention that were on the health insurance side. And one of those issues was the association health plans. In fact, over the past year, the NAIC has discussed the possibility of developing a model law and/or regulation relating to association health plans, and they were going to do that, especially given the somewhat recent federal regulation that's intended to facilitate the formation of such plans. But at this point, I think it's become clear that the NAIC is probably not going to proceed in developing that model, so we don't anticipate them taking on that project. There doesn't seem to be any consensus among the regulators on how to proceed. And it may not be necessary, as I think as most states already have a law governing multiple employer welfare plans or associated health plans already on the books. That having said that, though, the NAIC will, however, begin producing what they've called a best practices guide for regulators to reference, again, if a state wants to regulate an association health plan. So NAIFA did not yet submit any comments at this time on that, as we don't yet know what a best practices guide from the NAIC is going to entail, but this will be an effort that the NAIC will take on this year, and certainly if there's anything specific to agents and advisors, we'll certainly weigh in. Another issue at the NAIC is how state regulators should respond to the new federal regulations regarding what are called state relief and empowerment waivers. And in a nutshell, these are some soon-to-be available federal waivers that are intended to permit states to develop some alternative approaches to the ACA. These waivers, which previously were called state innovation waivers, they're authorized under the ACA, specifically Section 1332, and they may be granted to states under certain conditions. Now, there's going to be some more guidance from this from the Department of Health and Human Services, but we understand that a federal waiver could permit states, for example, to approve coverage that is specifically tailored to the needs of the consumer, maybe allowing non-ACA plans allowing states to determine that short-term limited duration plans count as health insurance coverage and other things as well. So the NAIC is not yet sure how to respond to this because, if enough of these waivers are granted, it could really reshape significantly the health insurance markets in the states, and by extension, how states would regulate that new landscape. So we do anticipate this will be an ongoing issue well throughout the year, probably into next. And so with this waiver concept, we haven't yet seen any areas that are specific to agents and advisors, but as that does come up at the NAIC, we'll certainly report any developments to members, and we'll respond. So those are two issues in particular on the health insurance front that are active at the NAIC, and there are some other areas as well. And I'll turn it back to Gary to talk about some other NAIC issues.
Thanks, Steve. Excuse me. The one issue I'm going to talk about that I'm involved with most at the NAIC deals with the whole standard of care issue. And I think you're going to find through this whole call that that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about, because the standard of care issue is active on the state level, it's active at the NAIC level, it's also active, as I'm sure you all know, with the SEC, and most recently, a number of months ago, we had a successful court outcome with our challenge to the Department of Labor fiduciary rule case. So standard of care is a very active issue. At the NAIC has had in place its Suitability in Annuity Transactions Model Regulation, which, as the name implies, imposes a suitability standard of care on annuity sales and recommendations. About a year and a half ago, the NAIC began the process of figuring out how, if to amend that regulation to enhance the standard of care to some type of a higher standard of care than is perceived to be provided by the suitability standard. NAIFA has been very involved in that effort all along with the NAIC here. I've testified at every NAIC meeting at which this has been discussed. We've submitted our own or been a part of industry comment letters, I think 4 times already on this issue. And the Suitability Working Group was sort of slogging through this, speaking frankly, and there was a lot of dispute among members of the working group. There was a lot of dispute with various members of the interested parties, which consist of our folks, including NAIFA in the insurance industry, folks on the consumer side of things, and other groups who are interested in this process. And they've had a number of conference call meetings. They've had 2 actual in-person interims meetings, one in Kansas City, one in Chicago, over the past year and a half. And I met personally down in Nashville a little more than a year ago with the chair of the working group, just myself, the chair and the vice chair, to talk about NAIFA's concerns with the model. Basically, the proposal where it stands now is the working group, which is basically the NAIC is organized with a series of committees, the Life Insurance Committee, the Health Committee, the Property Casualty Committee, and then the actual work on the model laws and model regulations on the various topics is done by subgroups, either working groups or task forces underneath these parent committees. So the Suitability Task Force is a subgroup under the Life Insurance Committee. Most recently at the November NAIC meeting, the Suitability Working Group decided it had basically gone as far as it could with revisions to the model. Like I said before, there were a lot of disagreements among both working group members and members of the interested party community over what should be in this model. The final place where the Suitability Working Group came out was that there should be some type of enhanced standard of care. They could never reach agreement on whether to use the actual term best interest standard of care, requiring producers and insurers to act in the best interest of that client. The most they could arrive at was having a standard where they would have to act in the interest of their client and not put the producer or the insurer's interest before that of the client. So they did not agree on any final revisions to the model that they wanted to move up to their parent committee, the Life Insurance Committee. And instead what they've done is they voted, or they didn't even vote actually, they just decided sort of informally to have the Life Insurance Committee take over this project going forward. It's kind of an unusual outcome. It's usually the working groups and task forces will agree on and recommend a series of amendments to a model to the parent committee, and then they'll go through it and that'll go on to the full NAIC body. But I think they realized that after this sort of good amount of time working on this, they had reached sort of a sticking point and were blocked and really weren't going to get any further. So they voted to move it on. They moved it on to the Parent Life Insurance Committee. So where it stands now is the Life Insurance Committee is now doing the work on this model. They released another draft of revisions to the model, which contains the types of revisions I mentioned before, meaning an enhanced standard of care that would require producers and insurers to work in the interests of their clients and consumers, not necessarily, but they don't use the words in the best interest. It does have some provisions regarding compensation disclosure, which NAIFA has traditionally opposed. And it has other provisions regarding what to do about non-cash compensation, producer training, things of that nature. Our view is that the model it's not in that bad shape, quite frankly. We're only going to get so far with it. I think we also always have to realize that while our side in these debates is always talking about, ways to restrict the model further, limit what the model does, we got to realize that there are folks on the other side of the issue, mainly the consumer representatives and such, who are always arguing to put more teeth into the model, have it go further, do more, put more restrictions on our activities. So right now, I think the model, we have some concerns, and the Life Insurance Committee has opened the model up for public comment. Comments are due on February 15th. NAIFA will be submitting comments. We're also working with an industry coalition on this. We may be submitting a coalition letter on behalf of several organizations, and we have regular conference calls to discuss this. So that's pretty much where this model stands right now. We're sort of wondering where this is all going to go. We're wondering if this is even going to turn into a final revised NAIC model. There's some talk that what the NAIC is looking for really is to have some type of a document, whether in finished or unfinished form, that they can go and talk with the SEC about. So it's a lot is up in the air with this version of it. Bottom line for me is I don't think it's that bad a document. NAIFA does support an appropriate best interest standard of care. That is one of our policy positions, and we've been working with the NAIC towards that end. And every bit of testimony I give, I always emphasize that our members already act in the best interest of their clients, and therefore we're not afraid of a best interest standard as long as it's crafted appropriately so as not to restrict the access of our clients to advice and products. That's where that issue stands right now. And I think right now we're going to turn to state legislatures and what the states have been up to. And again, let me turn things back over to Steve to talk about a couple of issues there. Steve?
All right, sure, no problem. Thanks, Gary. There are several issues that I want to raise that we see trending in the states, which I'll talk about. And the first of those is what we call the single payer or a government-run health insurance proposals. Now, in most years, we see maybe a state consider a bill to implement a single payer or government-run health insurance plan, and usually when those are introduced, they are usually rejected pretty overwhelmingly. However, this year we are seeing a trend of more states considering bills of this nature, and some now actually have potential to pass. In fact, most concerning is in California, where this has been considered in previous sessions, but now the proponents are actually getting significantly closer to maybe making this a reality. It's a concept that the governor supports as well as many state legislators. Similar bills might appear in Washington, possibly Colorado and Nevada, and maybe other states as well. The main obstacle to the single-payer plans is, of course, the cost and finding the revenue. Just a few years ago, I remember Vermont enacted a plan, but they abandoned it for lack of finding enough revenue to pay for it. But still, this is an issue that I think will be active in these states this year. NAIFA is often in industry coalitions that work to stop these plans, and we've of course long opposed the single-payer government-run style plan. So I think many state associations will be active in the coalitions to stop these bills from moving further. But this is definitely an issue and a trend we're seeing in the states. In another issue, over the past couple years, about a dozen states have enacted laws to address the topic of financial exploitation of seniors. A lot of these state laws are based on model legislation from the North American Securities Administrators Association, and they're basically the trade group that represents the state securities regulators. And This model requires financial advisors, makes it mandatory that advisors report suspected financial exploitation of a senior client to state authorities, and it allows the broker-dealers to place a temporary delay on executing a client's transaction if the broker-dealer suspects that financial exploitation might be involved. Now, NAIFA does not oppose these bills, although we do work to amend them so we get voluntary, not mandatory reporting, and we want liability protection for advisors who report a client's suspected transaction that may be a little suspicious to third parties and complying with the law. The NASA model that I referenced, I think this has been introduced in Virginia. It may also appear in New Hampshire, and I imagine other states as well. The securities regulators usually get this at least introduced in about half a dozen states at least. So I expect that's going to appear in more states. Last issue I'll bring up is the issue of CE credit for association membership. To date, about 10 states have laws and regulations on the books that allow financial advisors to get some CE credit for their active membership and participation in an agent trade association. Now, the amount of credit, of course, varies from state to state. But this year, the NAIFA state associations in North Dakota, New York, Tennessee, New Mexico, Michigan are all actually looking into getting this concept maybe enacted in their respective states, and so they're considering a number of other factors, reaching out to the DOI, possible bill drafting, see if there are state legislators that may be supportive. So all trying to gauge some support for the idea. So, and of course, at NAIFA National, we very strongly support this concept. So, but as it stands now, I think in the states, as things are, we see some major challenges, but there are also some major opportunities as well. And right now, I'll turn it back to Gary to maybe talk about some other issues that are trending in the states as well at this time. So,
and thank you for that information, Steve. We do have one comment regarding the information you just presented. New Mexico is doing single payer under the name of the Health Security Act. So thank you for that information,
good to know.
Linda.
Thanks, man. That's good to know. I was not aware, but Linda, thank you very much for mentioning that.
Great. Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Brendan. One thing I think you'll hopefully be realizing from what Steve and I are talking about here, and this is sort of at a 30,000-foot level comment, is that we think it's important that not only NAIFA but our state associations be seen as not saying no to everything. It's good to be in favor of something. I think if we can be in favor of some things and even be on the same side as the regulators, be on the same side on some issues if we can, as the consumer groups, I think that helps our credibility on all these issues. And I think both Steve and I are looking for situations where we can be in favor of something. That's why for example, the standard of care issue, we are not opposed to a best interest standard of care. We support it. It has to be appropriate. It has to be reasonable, etc., but we're in favor of that. Likewise, the number of the issues Steve talks about and Steve covers are issues where NAIFA is affirmatively pursuing something or pursuing things in a positive way as opposed to simply saying no to everything. So I think that's an important thing for all of us to keep in mind. Turning to issues I'm talking about and handling on the state level with the state lawmakers, two in particular I'll talk about. The first is, again, an issue I've talked about in the past, which is the issue of state-run retirement plans. These are proposals by state legislators where the state would establish or sponsor a retirement plan and then require employers who do not already offer their employees retirement plans to participate in the plan and then automatically enroll their employees in these plans with a permissible opt-out by the individual employee. This issue came on the scene basically a few years ago as we started seeing a lot more stories in the media about the retirement savings shortfall in this country, the crises in retirement savings. And NAIFA does not dispute the fact that there are retirement savings problems in this country. People aren't saving enough for retirement. We do disagree that the best approach to handling this problem is by having the states set up plans and programs that would unnecessarily compete with what's already available and being offered in the private market. We think so as a result, we oppose these state-run retirement proposals that are sort of categorized under the general heading secure choice plans. They're being largely pushed by the AARP and other groups in the states, and we think they could be very expensive for the states to start up. A number of states have adopted these secure choice plans: Illinois, Oregon, California, Maryland, Connecticut. And we've seen the one plan that has gotten started already. Oregon has started enrolling people. It's got a certain number of thousands of people, taken in some numbers of millions. But I think an important factor to note is that the state has already borrowed somewhere close to $10 million, I believe, to get this program up and running. And these things can be very costly to the states. NAIFA supports and favors a different type of approach, more of a marketplace-based approach, which was adopted in Washington State and New Jersey. And that basically would not have any kind of employer mandate, would not have a state-run plan, but what it would do is it would set up a clearinghouse to bring together employers who are interested in providing retirement plans to their employees, bring those folks together with private market providers of retirement plans through sort of this online clearinghouse to help these groups connect. Also, these plans, these marketplace-oriented plans, would basically serve an educational function, because a lot of the reason people don't save for retirement is they don't realize how much they need to save for retirement. They don't realize how much they need to have a secure retirement. And a lot of people mistakenly believe that either the Medicare or the Medicaid program is going to provide for retirement savings beyond the Social Security amount, and that's simply not the case. So what's going on now in the states, things have slowed down a little bit over the past couple of years, but we're still seeing, a decent amount of activity. New Jersey, unfortunately, is considering a plan now that would replace its marketplace approach with one of these secure choice types of plans. And our folks in New Jersey advise us that, unfortunately, that plan is likely to go through and be adopted. So it'll be another state that has a secure choice type of plans. We're also seeing a number of other states. Virginia is another state that's considering a secure choice type plan along with a marketplace type plan. And a lot of states are also considering now hybrid types of proposals. A lot of people are thinking this may just be the proponents of these plans way just to get something enacted in as many states as they can, regardless of whether it's a pure secure choice type plan or not. So I think while the state-run retirement plan issue has died down somewhat, it's still active in a lot of states. That's something you should keep an eye out for. The other issue I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, is the standard of care issue that's going on in the states. As most of you know, the SEC released last April its proposed regulation best interest, which would, as the name suggests, put in place a best interest standard of care for broker-dealers and their registered reps. It's for all securities transactions and recommendations. That came after about 10 years of the SEC talking about doing something but not doing anything. And the comments were due on the plan on this proposal back in August. And everybody's now in the process of waiting to see what the SEC is going to do on this. The latest SEC calendar for the next year indicated that they would finalize this regulation one way or the other by the third or fourth quarter of this year. We've heard some rumors that they may be on a more aggressive schedule and possibly do something in the second quarter or possibly even at the end of the first quarter. But with the government shutdown, the SEC is basically shuttered, and they haven't been able to do any work in this, so that could definitely postpone it. What's going on in the states is that we're seeing a number of states introduce their own proposals to put in place a fiduciary or a best interest standard of care for broker-dealers and their reps. Nevada, a couple of years ago, enacted a change to their legislation dealing with the fact that, Nevada has had in place legislation and a law that requires financial planners to adhere to a fiduciary standard of care. A couple of years ago, Nevada adopted a law that expands the definition of who is a financial planner to include broker-dealers, registered representatives, investment advisors, and what they call agents in some circumstances. We've been waiting for months and months and months and months for the Nevada Securities Department to propose regulations to implement that legislation. Finally, just this past Friday afternoon, the department issued its proposed regulations on this. We're all, meaning us in the industry, are in the process of reviewing this. In fact, I have a call next Monday with an industry group to talk about this. And we've been working with our folks out in Nevada, our government relations volunteers, as well as our state retained counsel out there to figure out how to address this. Some other states, New Jersey has issued a proposal, even though there's no actual proposed regulatory language, that they plan to put in place a fiduciary regulation for broker-dealers and the registered representatives. NAIFA New Jersey has submitted a couple of comment letters already and filed testimony, and testified in public at a couple of hearings held by the New Jersey Securities Department opposing this. And right now, our main avenue of attack on this is that the idea that consistency and uniformity is a very important goal here. It'd be a bad thing not only for insurers and producers and registered reps and broker-dealers, but also for these folks' clients if each state adopts something different, and then you have a total compliance nightmare. So our argument right now is the SEC is taking action now, the NAIC is taking action now. Let's wait to see what those groups do before the states go ahead in the interest of uniformity and consistency. Beyond New Jersey, Maryland is also considering activity on this issue. I've seen some writings from the legislature there that this is going to be on the agenda for the coming year. And several other states are thinking about doing something in the fiduciary area. I think the idea is that a lot of these states have either become fed up with the length of time it took the SEC and that it's taking the NAIC to act on this, or they're concerned that what the SEC and the NAIC are doing doesn't go far enough. And of course, we know that the state of New York recently adopted Regulation 187, which revises the New York annuity suitability model regulation to now have a best interest standard that is akin to a fiduciary regulation. And it also includes life insurance as well. So they basically took their existing regulation, beefed up the standard to what's in essence a fiduciary standard of care, and added the words "and life insurance" everywhere they could there, which is not the way we think this should be done. So this is an active issue in many states. It's a big, very important issue. We're working again with the ACLI on this, the Insured Retirement Institute, SIFMA, other groups on this. And this is going to be a really developing issue as this year and next year's come and pass. So I urge you all to really keep a close eye out for proposals of this nature in your state. And if you hear anything, please let us know. If you want any help on it, we're here to help you on it. That being said, I will stop talking right now. I don't want to keep you folks too long. We always try to limit these calls to about a half an hour, and we're just a couple of minutes short of that now. Let me ask Brendan if there are any more questions or comments.
We actually have one hand raised, and so I've gone ahead and unmuted the hand raiser. If you'd like to go ahead and make any comments. Or you can also type your questions or comments in the question box on the right side of your screen. So we'll pause a moment for any questions to come in or to hear any audio coming across. Okay, it looks like we, at this point, do not have any questions, verbal or otherwise.
Okay, well, great. In that case, thank you all for giving us your time and taking the time to listen to this. The next one of these calls will be held sometime following the next NAIC meeting, which will be held in early April of this year. Again, thanks very much for listening, and if you have any questions about any issues in your states, please feel free to give either Steve or myself, Gary, a call. Thanks.